Hi, welcome to the Cinematography Salon podcast, a show about celebrating cinematography and inspiring both the current and next generation of visual artists, exploring the latest trends, techniques, technologies, and culture, and featuring exclusive interviews with some of the most talented and innovative cinematographers working today. Hi everyone, welcome back. My name is Peter Pascucci and I'm joined by Ava Benjamin Shore, and this week we are honored to welcome the incredible DP Natalie Kingston to the show. Kingston's latest work can be seen in the triple Golden Globe nominated Apple TV show Blackbird, which was also nominated for 4 Emmy Awards, including Outstanding Cinematography for a Limited Series. Natalie has also shot projects like Alma Harrell's Free the Work campaign, earning a spotlight at the Cannes Lion Film Festival that same year. Today, Natalie is joining us from our home in LA, and we are so excited to chat about her work, her technique, and her perspective on cinematography. Welcome to the show, Natalie.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for taking the time to speak with us today. And we wanted to dive in. And I just wanted to start by congratulating you on being included in the ASC's 2023 Rising Stars of Cinematography, and was curious to hear what that meant to you when you received the news, and was also interested to kind of talk a little bit about gender representation in the ASC and what it felt like and what that moment was like for you to be a part of that legacy.
Obviously, it's a huge honor to be recognized by the people that inspire you and that you look up to. It's funny, when I got the email about it, I'm subscribed to the ASC newsletters. And so, you get a lot of like events and that kind of information and stuff like that and stuff about the magazine. And so I thought it was like, I was just quickly going through it and I almost deleted it. I thought, I was just like quickly reading and I was like, oh, wait, this is like specifically for me, and asking me if I was interested in being on this list of rising stars or something. But yeah, it's just a huge honor to be recognized amongst your peers. I'm so humbled. And and as far as gender representation in the ASC, I think there's still a lot of work to be done. There definitely has been progress made for sure. Even, from the time when I first started out, probably like over 10 years ago, 12 years ago, something like that, to now, there's been a lot of positive changes and more women in the ASC and people of color. But yeah, there's still a lot of work to be done. So I think the more the ASC can recognize non-white males is progress. So I'm happy and proud to be a woman who has been recognized.
It's so cool. Yeah, you touched on something that I thought was really fascinating when getting to know you and your work. And it's the fact that you did start like a little bit later, and it's something you've talked about. But I would love to, for people who don't know, like, could you just talk a little bit about what it was like to start a career as a cinematographer a little bit later, and maybe how that's informed your work now, and anything you're willing to share about that. I think it's inspiring for people who, I feel like just in our industry, it can be so competitive and it can be so much about your age and where you're at in your career. And it's really inspiring to see that you started later and now that you're being recognized by the ASC and doing all this incredible work. Yeah, I'd love to just hear a little about that.
Yeah, I think it's all relative. I think it was late because I wasn't like 20. But in the grand scheme of things, it's not like, I guess, I had other jobs and stuff before I found cinematography. And, it was before I was even in the film industry. And I think it's just because, I didn't go to film school. And I knew from an early age that I wanted to work in film. That was set in to me when I was like 10. With my parents' video camera, and the idea of like being behind the camera making movies. Of course, I didn't know what a cinematographer was growing up in a small town in South Louisiana, but I feel like no one could really point me in the right direction. So I kind of really paved my own way, and it was a longer journey. So I'd been working in the industry maybe 4 or 5 years before I was like, okay, I'm going to pursue cinematography specifically. So I was around like 28 or 29 when I decided to go full on being a cinematographer. So I guess I was like around 25, 26-ish when I got my first job at a TV station. And then that led to being on a film set for the first time as a camera assistant, and then did all kinds of things in the industry before narrowing it down to like, okay, yeah, this is where I really see myself fit in naturally. So I think maybe if I were to do it all again, I would go to film school just to have that time to sort of have a safe space to make things and learn film theory. But I don't regret my path. And I think I've had a lot more life experiences that do inform my work today. And I'm grateful for all of the experiences that I've had on set, from camera assisting, operating. I've worked as an editor. That editing experience has just been huge, being a DP now, just knowing what you need to tell a story. Because I edited for a handful of years, like at the TV station and then at a post house. So I think all of that has just made me pretty versatile. And I think every one of those things has definitely informed the type of cinematographer I am today.
It's so cool. Yeah. And I remember hearing you talk a little on Lost Bayou about how coverage, like you were very intentional about the amount of coverage you needed. And I imagine that a part of that was that editing background. And I feel like that actually is a really important thing that some DPs, like having that understanding of editing is so huge, just for being able to work quickly and being confident in your choices for coverage and stuff. It's really cool.
And even being able to suggest things to a director, like, oh, what if we do this and it could cut with this, and then maybe we don't need this. If we, I think just having that understanding is really huge.
I'd be curious to know, prior to you having a conscious idea that you wanted to be a cinematographer, I think there's always little tells when you're younger of like, I think your sensitivity to light is pretty special. And I'm curious to know, like, were there things that you were doing prior to that conscious decision, like photography or even just admiring certain things about life? Like, what were things that you were just kind of enjoying prior to that choice to be a DP?
Yeah, well, I was a very, very creative child. I was never, ever, ever, ever bored. I, in fact, just had so much stuff to do, and I still feel that way. It's just like, I don't have enough time in this one lifetime to do it all. So I was just constantly doing things and brainstorming. And we didn't really watch movies growing up. My parents weren't big film people, so like I wasn't exposed to a lot of films, but we did go to the theater a lot. My mom and my grandmother, my aunts took us a lot to like the theater to see live theater, musicals and plays. That was a big part of my life growing up. I was in a lot of plays with the church or school. I was in the choir, and yeah, so I would put on lots of plays with my cousins and my sister, the neighborhood kids. And nothing was ever simple. Like, it was always a pretty big production. I would put on like little circuses. I would do photo shoots with Barbies. Speaking of, my mom just sent me. I posted on Instagram recently, but like, this is one of my favorite. And isn't the light great? Like the backlit.
Those creamy film highlights.
Yeah, like this is all.
I love it.
It's like a whole series. So it was like stuff like that all the time. So when my parents brought home the VHS camcorder at age 10, it was like, okay, that's another tool in the arsenal. What if I film these plays? And those became little movies. And that became like Natalie going to the library, checking out children's stage play books, converting those into films, and making my friends and my sister be in them. And so I forget your original question, but oh yeah, sensitivity to light and stuff. I wasn't really aware of light per se back then, but I think just always being creative and always looking for ways to entertain myself, I guess, was like one thing I was doing. And then also just like making art out of things. It couldn't just be like simply playing with Barbies. It was like, okay, how to make that something I could share with people. Or I guess it's kind of boils down to communication, because art is communication, right? So yeah, it was a lot of that. I did have an abstract idea of, when I got that camcorder on my shoulder, that idea of telling stories and making things with video, with moving images, that could maybe be something I could do one day, but it was very abstract.
Yeah. I'd be curious to know if we could get a little bit more into light. In previous interviews, I know you've talked about the light in Louisiana being really special, and I've spent time there too. It is very different than Los Angeles, where you and I live. Like, can you describe what the difference in lighting is here in Los Angeles or California compared to Louisiana?
Well, they're very different, and I think they both have really interesting qualities. In LA, we have that layer of smog, so that naturally diffuses the light, and it's pretty consistent. So I think there's a lot of diffused light a lot of the time, but it's also sharp at the same time, if that makes sense. And I think because it's just so bright and gold, and there's also like a lot of concrete, pavement, beige buildings. There's also a lot of color too, but beige is a prominent thing. So there's just like a lot of bouncing of this warm light. And to me, it just kind of creates this almost like iridescent quality, which I find really intriguing. And it's all very blue and gold, because the blue skies rarely with clouds and the golden light, versus South Louisiana, which is a very humid place, a lot of very unique textures. And it's really hard to articulate because it's more of like a feeling, but there's a certain layer of grit that's ever present there, even in New Orleans, or even where like I'm originally from, which is around the Acadian area, Cajun country. And I'd say my favorite time of year would be the winters in Louisiana, in the Acadian area, in swampland. And it's very much like in a Wyeth painting. It's brown, very little, if any, green at all. So it's brown, blue, yellow is the palette. And there's this kind of hauntingly beautiful thing about it. And I love shooting in the winter in Louisiana.
Yeah. So I guess moving on, I'd be curious to know, as someone who started a little bit later in their career as a cinematographer and also started in Louisiana is not considered like a big market for the film industry. Do you think there's any benefits of coming out of somewhere like Louisiana as opposed to initially setting foot in like New York or Los Angeles, where a lot of people reside that want to do the same job?
Yeah, I'll say this just based on my personal experience. I don't think there's a right or wrong way to do it. And I think there can be success for, starting out in New York City or starting out in LA or starting out in a small town. But I think it worked out well for me because I was able to create a lot of my own projects. I was, it's a lower cost of living, obviously, in New Orleans. So I felt like I was able to shoot more short films and passion projects as a DP and didn't have to necessarily work as a crew member to make ends meet. So I felt benefits in that, and it was just a less overwhelming place to begin. And I felt like I could just kind of stick out there. And for me, making the move to LA, I guess made that a bit easier of a transition. I started off really in Lafayette, Louisiana, which is even smaller than New Orleans. The film community is tiny. And so that was just making short films with friends. And my husband's a director now, but we started a film production company when we were in Lafayette, and we would do local and regional commercials. That was a lot of our work. So that's what I mean by we got to create a lot of our work, and we did a lot of passion projects, and that was just really easy to do there, And then that transitioned to New Orleans, and, I got a little more work. And then, I ended up getting my first agent when I was still living in New Orleans, and towards the end of my time living there, I was not working there as much, but traveling elsewhere, wherever that may be. And so then it just kind of made sense to make the move. Bride and I kind of fought that for a long time because we love home so much, and, because he's from there as well. All of our family's there, and we just loved living in New Orleans. And but we just felt the pull to be closer to the heart of the industry. So we finally did it in 2020. And it just felt like the time to do it. And it felt like a natural progression, and we both needed it.
Can you talk more about working with your husband, Brian, on projects? Because you guys have done short form stuff and you've done a feature together. I can't imagine working with my partner.
Yeah.
on
It
a
either
film.
works or it doesn't. That's it.
So how do you
Yeah.
guys, how do you balance that? Like, that seems
Yeah.
so difficult.
Yeah. Yeah. Very good question. And we've worked with each other in many different capacities because he does so many things and it's evolved through the years. But we primarily work together as director, him directing and me shooting. He started off as DP when I first met him. I was just starting my journey as a DP and he had been shooting for a couple of years. And it was one of the things that brought us together. And from day one, we're inspired by the same things, inspired by the same artists, drawn to the same kind of films, inspired one another. I remember like the first few months of our relationship was just emailing each other back and forth like inspiration. We were just like nonstop. And just dreaming things up together. And so it works for us. And I totally understand how it wouldn't work for some people. But the first thing we did together as director DP was a music video. And it just worked out really well. And he was kind of the director by default because I didn't want to direct. And yeah, we were just really happy with how it came out. In the beginning, I think we argued a little more because we were still trying to find ourselves as artists and still trying to really find our confidence. And we just both had something to prove, let's say. And then as we matured and worked together more, we lost the egos and it became a lot easier. After that, we did commercials, like I was saying, through our company, and some short documentaries and more passion projects and music videos. And then his first feature is called Lost Bayou, which I shot. And then now we're gearing up to shoot his second one, hopefully next year.
Oh, amazing. That's so cool.
Yeah, I love it.
Our relationship I'm so grateful because it's evolved so beautifully. And I think to answer your question about balance, it's for us, we really have to draw the line in the sand of like, okay, we're in work mode and this is work mode. You can't take things personally as maybe you would as husband and wife here. And then once we're not in work mode, we're in married couple mode. And so if we're working on something, it's usually like kind of all in work mode. And especially him as the director, me as the DP, it's impossible nearly to turn that off, like especially during a feature. And we've learned as we've done it all, as we went about how to get better at balancing. And it's all just, you learn as you do it. And there still is balance even about what projects I take and if he's at home writing and does he come with me. And he comes with me on all of my long form projects that I'm shooting, and most commercials he doesn't because they're so quick and it doesn't make sense. But we try to keep it together for the long form stuff. And I'm so lucky because a lot of people, their partner, maybe they don't work in the industry and they don't have a flexible job where they can just pick up and go. But we're really lucky we can do that. And it works out. Yeah.
So cool. Yeah, it's so inspiring. And I love what you said about figuring out how to let the ego go. And of course, with age and with experience, how you're able to just enjoy each other as collaborators and as creative partners. It's super beautiful. One thing that we've talked on the show in the past about is the elusive thing referred to as shorthand. And you've talked about it a little bit as well. And I'd love to just hear your perspective on shorthand as it refers to your husband or to other collaborators or even crew members. But yeah, we had someone on the show say something that stuck with me, which was that they felt like shorthand wasn't the right term. And that what she was saying was that it's really just about intimately understanding someone else down to like the fibers of their being and sort of on a spiritual level. And I'd love to hear about how you've navigated the shorthand with your collaborators and what that's meant for you.
I can agree with that. It's a very deeply intimate thing when it works. And I think you're symbiotic. You are in sync on a spiritual level for sure. And it's just like any other relationship, like an intimate relationship you may have in your personal life. I think there are definitely some layers of that in a collaborative relationship for sure. And I think that's one of the things I love most about working with directors. And when we really hit it off, it can be so meaningful and it can really have just an impact on your life. And it's way more than a shorthand. I think shorthand is like a byproduct of that. I think as a DP, it's really about listening, really, truly, truly listening and not just hearing. really trying to understand where the director is coming from and what they are trying to say with the film. And I feel like that's the only way to really be the best collaborator that you can be. And when you have that sincerity and that integrity of their vision, then when you come to the table with your ideas, it's always coming from their inspiration and the seed that they planted in you. And I think sometimes some people, you just like, it's love at first sight, and you hit it off immediately and you have that chemistry and it just works. You communicate the same way, your sensibilities are just naturally lined up, and that can evolve and grow and get stronger and stronger. And some people, it's maybe not as strong at first, but I think the more time you spend with that person and being vulnerable with one another, I think that's huge, very huge, and can translate on set and creates that safe space in your relationship. But I think that time getting to know a director, especially when you're working together for the first time, of watching movies with one another, just sharing a meal is so huge, or having a drink, or going to see art, or going for a walk. Like, all of those moments really, really add up. And it's the same thing as like in an intimate relationship, how the things you do to nurture those relationships and can make the whole experience just so special. And I think that's just what's so beautiful about what we do, is we get to have those experiences within our work. And that's just really magical. We're not just behind a desk at a bank. We get to go off and make some money and get to know a person from wherever they're from, who's had their set of experiences. And that's joined with yours and your cultural background and all your life experiences. And you're there in a compressed period of time, making something bigger than the two of you. And of course, all the other collaborators, but we're just talking about director, DP. And that's really special. That changes your life.
100%. Wow. Yeah. Gosh, the point about listening is just such a valuable. It's everything. Yeah. And it's maybe one of the hardest things. And one of the most nuanced things about what we do is setting the ego aside, being sort of a student to the creative process and all of those things. It's just, it's so brilliant. I kind of wanted to back up just for a second and talk about one thing, which, and now that we're into some of this more kind of like ethereal qualities of being a DP and some of these things that are more nuanced about the craft, I'd love to also just touch briefly on some of the technical. And I think that your work is so unbelievably beautiful. And when I look at it, it really does have a density to it, and sort of, it just feels weighty and it feels very considered and very precise. And I think that with cinematographers, especially now that we're kind of in the digital age and stuff, like, it's often talked about shooting a dense negative digitally. And that term's kind of thrown around a lot as kind of a goal for how we capture digital. And I think that I really see that density in your work, and I'm curious how you achieve that. And I'm curious if it's related to exposure decisions or lighting, or maybe involvement in post-production or other factors. Yeah, I'd love to just hear you talk about how you achieve your look.
I think it's a little bit of everything in terms of lighting. I'm always like trying to light the space, but I'm always thinking about lighting in layers. And usually it's the background first. And we all do that, trying to create depth within lighting. So I'm always trying to find ways to add as much depth as possible with lighting, and whether that's just like a ping of a highlight somewhere in the background or the foreground or something, which maybe isn't completely motivated, but it's emotionally resonant. And there's an emotional reality to that, and you don't question it. And then, color depth is big, and that's either achieved with color in lighting itself, whether that is mixing and contaminating different colors and contrasting colors, using multiple colors through one big rag or something like that, like having a prominent color that's warm and then having just the tail end of that a little green or something, or, filling in with an opposing contrasting color to one degree or another. I'm always trying to find, like, with color, like, nothing is really ever pure. It's like white is always a little dingy or contaminated. So maybe tungsten has a little bit of green into it or stuff like that. and just making everything kind of bleed into one another, like you see in paintings. And I feel like that gives it life. And then also like in the color grade, maybe it's like adding a hint of a color into another, adding a hint of cyan and white or something like that, furthering that contamination. And then of course, I'm always protecting the higher end in digital, trying to preserve as much dynamic range as possible. And then working closely with the costume designer and production designer is obviously really important with what we do. And yeah, and I work in a pretty precise way. Like I have really specific plans for everything, and that could change on the day, but I like having my head really wrapped around like how we're gonna light every single scene. And a lot of times that's doing diagrams of bigger setups and being really precise and specific about it. And yeah, I feel like it's just kind of all of those things at play.
Wow. I love what you said about stacking your key light, like mixing different tones within a rag is something that is so unique. That's so cool to hear you talk about.
I just really got into doing that a lot on this last film that I shot in New York. It's not out yet, but my gaffer, Evan Lowe, and I like really played a lot with color on that film in lighting, and doing that just naturally evolved in such a beautiful way in collaborating with one another. And maybe I'd done it a little bit before, but it's something we did a lot on that film, and it was so much fun.
Well, it's so interesting because it's like going back to the LA thing really quick, what you mentioned about gold and blue and how it's a lot of bounced light. It's like, I feel like in the natural world, what we're being keyed by is the blue sky, as well as the gold bounce, as well as the fluorescent bus stop light. And like all of those different tones are part of the key. And so recreating that with your gaffers is really cool.
Yeah, I love observing that kind of stuff in real life and making note of how all of that is working together and trying to achieve that on set.
Are you always thinking in terms of motivated sources, or are you also conceptually approaching it sometimes? Like say in Shapeless, like there are some very colorful choices for lighting. What's the basis for some of those?
It usually starts from like, what is the motivation? Because that helps narrow things down in my brain. Because if the sky's the limit, that can be overwhelming. And I think restrictions allow for more creativity. So it's like, okay, where would the light naturally come from? And then from there, I think all sources do not have to be motivated, but as long as they're emotionally real for the scene and for what the characters are experiencing at an emotional level. As long as there's an emotional truth to that light. And I don't think people will question unmotivated sources, as long as it's just in line with the visual language and with the emotions of that scene. And I think it's fun, like being able to think of ways to just add light that's not necessarily motivated, but just creates a feeling more than anything else. Yeah.
Are you moved by some of the lighting that you create on set? Like, does it hit you emotionally and you go, yeah?
Oh my God, yes. I'm like, when I see it, it's like, yeah, I'm sure y'all do too, where you get that feeling, you walk into a space, you're like, oh, yeah, I'm so sensitive to light. Like it can affect me like physically, it can have like a physical reaction of like my heart racing or just my heart dropping or getting lightheaded. But oh yeah, absolutely.
Wow.
I have a funny story. So I had, our wedding was at my mom's house, and she has this beautiful courtyard in her backyard and this garden and everything. And over the courtyard is this like trellis, and she has string lights over it. And it's really beautiful. Well, she changed them out right before the wedding, and she got LED. And so I got to her house, and she turned all the lights on. She was so excited, and they're like so green. I'm like, oh no, my heart drops. I'm like, okay. It's like, we gotta change them all. I'm sorry.
Oh my God.
And this is like, I mean, it's a lot. I didn't make her do it, but my husband, and maybe my stepdad helped, or maybe my husband did it all by himself, tore them all down and put them in incandescent lights. But I mean, the pictures couldn't have a green. It was just like, it needed to be like pure tungsten warm.
I love that. That's so funny. It's also like not only the green, but I feel like those bulbs you buy from the store that are string lights can be so piercing. Like there'll be like tons of different shadows because of how like hard the source is and stuff. It's the worst.
Yeah.
And they don't really dim or anything. So it's like,
Exactly.
Honestly, though, I brought up a question for me that I was thinking about because I've heard you talk about lighting with par cans and lighting with tweenies and things like that. And I think that that's not super common. And I think that I feel more and more people are really leaning into your Vortex or your 360 or like Titans or whatever. And like, I was curious just what your thoughts are on tungsten and if you do love tungsten for any particular reasons. And to me, it's like going back to that density of your images. I can imagine that that's a part of it, is those choices.
Oh my God, yeah. I mean, LED is fantastic and they use a lot of LED lighting, but it still doesn't replace tungsten fixtures. There's just that softness of a tungsten lamp that you just cannot get from an LED source. So I will always carry tungsten on the electric truck. I think 9 lights down to tweenies are just absolutely stunning. And sometimes like that's specifically the lamp for the job. I think it's a quality and color thing that I think just hasn't been replicated yet.
100%.
Do you find that when you're working with different gaffers, I'd be curious to know like how much of their style or input is influencing you? Because I think that across the scale of projects that I've seen of yours, I would say there's like a pretty consistent voice. And I'd be curious to know how working with different key crew might change or influence that at all.
I think it can influence the type of fixture because, there's some gaffers who have a bunch of sky panels and some who have vortex, cream source stuff. And I think every gaffer they have their toolkit and that definitely influences what we'll use. And I think I'm usually open to the type of lamp. And it's a conversation, and if it can achieve the thing that I'm going for, then that will totally work. But if there's like a specific thing I'm looking to do with a specific light, then I'll make sure that we do it that specific way. And there's always a reason for that because, like working with tungsten, that will give you a very specific quality that you just cannot get from a vortex. But yeah, I think in terms of, like I said before, I'm like pretty specific on how I want to light a scene and the direction and quality and shape and color of the light is pretty mapped out. But I'm also very collaborative, but I know what I'm trying to achieve.
I kind of wanted to circle back. I just honestly, like something you said really resonated about how light can be motivated from an emotional truth rather than from a traceable natural source. And I think that's so brilliant because it does open up the world of lighting to so many more possibilities when you're thinking in that way. And like, it almost feels like now that you've said that, like it feels restrictive to be like, is it coming through a window? Is it coming from a laptop screen? Is it coming from, where is it coming from? When really it could be the most surreal lighting possible. But like you said, if it's telling the story or if it's conveying some sort of emotion, then the viewer's not going to question it. And yeah, I just thought that was articulated so well. And I'm curious, like, when did you have that revelation? Was that, because for me, like I've worked with certain directors where they speak that language and it helps me think differently about lighting. Did it come from that or did it come from something else? When did that sort of click for you?
Years ago, I was shadowing Michael Goy on I think it was the first season of American Horror Story. And he told me that. He's like, everything doesn't have to be motivated. As long as it works emotionally for the scene, the audience will not question it. And the light can come from anywhere. And I'm like, huh. And that was a revelation for me. Like, yeah, oh, you're totally right. Totally right. It's just painting within this particular canvas of emotions. It's all about feeling.
I love that. And I also love the way that you refer to contamination and how that's how you perceive paintings. That's just really fascinating.
That's really inspired too by Ed Lockman. Like I'm a huge fan of his work and I've studied so much of it. And he uses that word contamination. And when I first heard him say that, that really resonated with me because he's right. That's how painting, the color and paintings interact. And it just feels so alive and less sterile. when things are just pure and naturally hard cut. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I think that's even something that I've heard James Gray and Darius Kanji talk about too, where if you look at paintings and study them, a lot of times there is no pure black. Like black will have a color to it.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think it's really exciting that cinematography to me has sort of taken a direction, you know, in the past couple decades where it feels a lot more, I don't know if experimental is the right word, but there is a little bit more opportunity to play with color, because if you look at some films from maybe the 80s or 90s, there's a lot of just corrected sources. And obviously not everyone is doing that, but it feels a little bit limiting to think of changing every fluorescent and color correcting, you know, like minus green or plus green, or having to match everything to a certain color temperature. And I feel like it kind of sucks some of the life out of life, you know?
Yeah, that's why I love Ed's work so much. And I know he believes in color not being, how did he say it exactly? It's like color is more of like a psychological thing and not necessarily just a symbolic thing. Like where Storaro is more of like representational with color. Like yellow means this, green means envy, da 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 da. But Ed thinks about it more on an emotional, psychological level. Like how does red make you feel? You know, how does tungsten, how does yellow make you feel?
Yeah.
So I have one more lighting question and then we can move on. But I heard you mention that you kind of really started to understand light more fully on your path when you studied at Maine Media Workshop. And it seems like such an incredible program, and one that I think for a lot of aspiring cinematographers would be cool for people to hear about. But I'd love for you to, just explain kind of what you mean by having that moment of realizing light. Was it a technical thing of sort of learning metering, or was it more kind of the stuff that we've been talking about? And beyond that, I'm sort of interested, something that I think that personally I'm always trying to get better at is how to convey some of this knowledge of lighting in a way that is accessible to a director or to a collaborator, and being able to get your desired result from a technical standpoint, but without being too technical in the way that you explain it.
Yeah. So in Maine, I went there in 2011. Like I said, I didn't go to film school, but I found this program at Maine Media Workshops in college, and it was like a 3-month program. It's a cinematography intensive, and every week was like a different workshop, all from like 16 millimeter classes to location lighting to like feature film lighting to camera movement. A lot of lighting classes. It was very lighting heavy, and it was all like ASC DPs coming in and teaching these classes, and successful gaffers, etc. And I went there because, you know, I was starting to shoot maybe a couple years in or something, and just shooting on my own, you know, shorts with friends. And I knew I was like lacking in lighting, really. I just never really got my hands on lamps, except for like a couple Kinos and a Lowell kit with the umbrella. But I just didn't know what to do with light. And I knew that was like a big form of communication, obviously, and it's a huge tool. It's like the crux of cinematography. And I saw that they offered a lot of lighting workshops, and I knew someone had gone there, had a good experience. So I'm like, okay. So I was like really set on learning more about lighting and getting my hands on different fixtures. And then really that's what happened. And yeah, I learned how to light meter there, you know, exposed for film, learned a lot of technical things about light. But the light bulb went off just with how to really start to see light over there, because we analyzed a lot of films. You know, we would watch movies that a DP has shot or a gaffer has lit, and watch them in silent, and they would talk about how they lit the scenes. And that was just like, oh my God, you know, head exploding. I remember one assignment there that was just so profound to me at the time, and it seemed so simple, but it really got me to see light, was we had to pick like a Renaissance painting that inspired us, and we got to recreate the lighting from that painting. And that's when I realized, oh my God, like paintings have light, and that translates in a way that I can light in film. And I was like, oh God, I could study painting and learn lighting. And we would take still photos, in classes, and that was a way of really starting to see light. And, I still do that, but that was a big thing, after I got back from Maine, was continuing to take still photographs and just noticing light in everyday life, and really just constantly exercising that muscle of seeing light and how it falls and bounces and bends and wraps and all of that stuff. And I just became absolutely obsessed with it and still am. It's like I can't stop. I'm sure y'all are the same way. Like, it just every day you're just, like right now, just, see it. And, I like keep a lighting journal, and it's so amazing how light can just have such an emotional effect on humans. And it's a form of communication for us.
Yeah.
It's so powerful. And I think that's just how I talk about light to collaborators, to directors. Obviously with gaffers, it's more technical, or it can be. But with directors, it's all about emotion and feeling. And it's like really understanding like what they're trying to achieve emotionally, and like, okay, the character is experiencing grief right now. If she's hiding from X, Y, and Z, and this is just so simple, but like if we silhouette her here, then this will create this feeling because of this, so it's really just talking about like framing it in such a way of like how I can see it affecting the audience and what emotional impact it'll have on the audience if we light the scene in a particular way. So that's usually how the conversations go, because I never want to bog down a director and like, yeah, we'll be diffused with this particular diffusion or 2 stops over. It's more like, yeah, it's going to feel hot and maybe overexposed, or like it's going to feel like really dark, but just like a sliver of light so we can show that hope here or something like that. And I'll talk that way with gaffers and key grips as well, for them to understand where we're coming from or what we're trying to achieve emotionally. And then that evolves into a more technical conversation. But I think it's important for them to, of course, all be with you on the same page as what we're trying to achieve emotionally.
Beautiful. Hi, we are excited to announce our partnership with Laowa Lenses by Venus Optics. Laowa has had a long history of providing cinematographers with unique and state-of-the-art lens options, including their recent Proteus 2x anamorphic series, which remains the most accessible T2.0 option in the market for professional production. A big thank you to SanDisk for helping support our show as well as part of their Relentless Reliability campaign. The extreme portable solid-state drive has become an essential on film sets and a personal favorite of mine for how durable, reliable, and fast it is. SanDisk leads in drive and memory card technology, emphasizing not just storage, but everything worth keeping.
What's interesting is I hear a lot of conversation about lighting a space, which I think is very important, but I personally am kind of obsessed with people's faces. And when I watch your work, I am just so enamored with the way that people's faces are lit. And I just wonder if you're also studying people's faces on top of the light. Like if
oh my
it's,
God, yeah.
Yeah, because the way, like, in Blackbird, there's edges and there's lots of shadows on people's eyes, but it's never ugly. It always feels really nice on the person's face. You know what I mean?
Like they just fell into it like perfectly.
So like, are you doing anything in pre-production? Like, do you like to do camera tests with people, or are you studying people's faces ahead of time?
Yeah, I mean, for Blackbird, we did camera tests with all the leads, but not every project you do that. But yeah, I'm obsessed with faces too. And as you continuously light someone, you see how their face reacts to lighting and how easily the light wraps into the other eye, or if they need more or less wrap. And that's just so cool. And I love to geek out with gaffers about that. And I'm just like, oh yeah, notice, or key grips even too, of how people take light and what they need and what diffusions work well with them, or how much fill they need. But I think when I think about lighting a space, I'm trying to like get away with as few special lights as possible. For instance, if it's a day interior, pushing light from the outside in, and if I can get away with just those fixtures outside the window and not having to bring a unit in, and the actor falls into the light in a good way, that light coming in through the window, then that's kind of lighting the space. But even if you bring in an additional light, I think you're still approaching it from that concept of lighting the space. But I think it's so fun to just have the space lit, have the stand-in hit the marks and see how they naturally fall to the room lighting. And if there's any other specials that you need to add, that's that last layer that you do to maybe just extend that wrap into the other eye or just have a little edge or whatever.
Yeah. I've asked for lighting tests before on, say, like features or small shows. I've never gotten one. So I'd be curious to know, like, what did you find was successful or important to look at? Like, what were you testing? And did you have a lighting team with you? Like, what did you want to figure out from those tests?
Every project's different depending on the budget and what they'll give you. But for Blackbird, I didn't have much prep on the front end. It was very condensed most of the time with scouting, but I did do a camera and lens test, and I had a gaffer and key grip and a camera assistance there. And that was really just to figure out the lenses that I wanted to use. And then we had a couple different units that we looked at of like playing with broad strokes lighting, but it was really more or less for lenses. And that was just with stand-ins. I couldn't have the actors because that test was also, we did lighting, that was a bigger test and that was on a stage where the first one was at Panavision. So the second test was more of like, they call it more like hair, makeup, costume test. And, the studio just wants to see how the actors look on camera in their costume. And so it was like a full crew, full shoot day. And art department brought in different slats for different wall colors. And we looked at that. So that was pretty comprehensive. Lost Bayou, we did, that was a really low budget indie film, but we had the access to the location, our main location, which was a houseboat pretty early on. So we brought in the actor and got him dressed in a couple costume options with the costume designer there, the production designer there. The production designer was already working on things in the houseboat, so we could photograph him in the setting. And that was so very helpful to pick the color of the main wardrobe that he was going to wear for pretty much the whole movie. So we got to see him in the exteriors and then put him inside. And I think we just used natural light for that. But I've never just had like a lighting specific test. It's always like combining things into one test,
It's cool that there was a shoot day dedicated to that on that project. It's a little separate, but I'm just sort of curious to hear about what it was like to scale up to the level of Blackbird, and like specifically, like you mentioned having these moments where you were longing to just grab a camera and go shoot a sunset, but you like turned around and just saw a city of production trailers and was like, oh, I can't even was it stifling in any way? Or obviously the world that you're building is so cinematic and you have all the tools and all the people you need. So I'm sure that there's that side of it, but then there's this other side of it that's wanting to just chase something or chase an intuition. So I'm just curious, like when you arrive at a set like that, like how you kind of navigate those two things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good question. I think you nailed it. You have a ton of resources and a huge crew, but you're not very nimble. That's kind of the exchange. Whereas like on an indie film, you can pick up and like change your mind at the last second and do something completely different, maybe, because something looks great over there. And I think you can kind of do that to a degree on something on a larger scale. But yeah, when the sea of trucks are behind you and it's going to take 40 minutes to move, sometimes this is not possible.
I feel like what I see too is I'm sure that subconsciously you're kind of imbuing the more constructed worlds with that spontaneity that you just kind of are always inspired by. It's like it works its way into those scenes because it's just a part of what interests you and what you respond to emotionally in the natural world and everything. And it's super beautiful. One off-script comment about the fine art thing, which I'm so glad we touched on, is like, it was cool to hear you mention that it's almost like once you realize that lighting exists in fine art, it's almost like now you have an infinite reference wall of lighting. It's like you can go to a museum and be like, oh, like I can light something like that. Yeah, I just thought that was like, I never thought of it that way, but that's cool.
Yeah, exactly. You're not just restricted to, I guess, in that moment in main media, it's like, oh, wait, I don't just like have to look at movies to be inspired to make when making movies. It can be still photographs or paintings. And yeah, it just opened up a whole other well.
So cool. You've spoken about the importance of avoiding being arbitrary as a visual artist. And I feel like that's something that's actually super relevant right now, because I think that with social media and with the onslaught of like everyone being able to shoot and the accessibility of being a filmmaker, like we are sort of inundated with trends and with chasing trends and with all different types of image making. And like it sort of made so much sense to me that one of your guiding principles is to not be arbitrary in the way that you make images, and always asking yourself about the why of an image. And so I'm curious how that philosophy differs between narrative and commercial, and how you sort of manage switching those different modes, where maybe on a commercial it's okay to be a little bit more like quote unquote arbitrary, or I'd love to just hear you talk about that philosophy. It's really, really interesting.
Yeah, totally. I think I try to be intentional with everything, but I think with commercials it's really more all about style. You're selling a product at the end of the day. Also, it's not just the director's vision. It's you have a whole ad agency, you have a whole client group, a whole brand to adhere to, and there's a lot of different entities that you're creating within. So I think it's definitely a different way of shooting or thinking about shots and lighting, especially like shot design with commercials, because you usually only have 30 seconds or less, and so that style is important. And I think to be catchy and grab someone's attention really fast is important in a commercial space. So it's really just kind of like, really at the end of the day, as long as the ad agency and the client and are happy, that's kind of what matters. And and I try to infuse my ideas and when it works. And of course inherently my sensibilities are mixed up in there as well. But for narrative projects, you're really telling a story or a deeper story, and there are a lot more complex emotions, and there are actors involved. And this is when I really ask, why? And I think it's important to understand the why of it all before you determine the how. And sometimes it's something that just is a feeling, and something just feels more right to do than something else, and maybe you can't articulate. But I think if you're not coming from a place of like, this is a cool shot, this could be cool for the sake of, or just because you have this particular equipment and this tool, I think that never drives me. It never has. Yeah, of course, I'm a cinematographer. I can geek out on cool equipment and technology, but I've never been a gearhead per se, and that ultimately doesn't get me the most excited. I think that what gets me the most excited is telling stories and figuring out what combination of the tools of cinematography work the best to tell this particular story, and creating a unique visual language for every film. And that's hands down what's always excited me the most, and always will excite me the most. And I'll never let the technology drive or inform my decisions, because I honestly just think that's boring and quite superficial.
Yeah, I think it was really beautifully said. You kind of answered this, but I guess I'm curious just to ask it, and we can be brief. But have you ever caught yourself asking the how before the why, and having to sort of take a moment to be like, wait, it's not about the how, actually, it's about the why? Because I think as cinematographers, it can be sometimes easy to get swept up in gear, swept up in technique.
Yeah, I think so. I think maybe sometimes where you and the director maybe get away from your original intention or a scene, and you have to bring yourself back to that original intention of okay, wait, what are we trying to say here in this scene? What is it about here? Okay, yeah, it's about this. It's about X, Y, and Z. And sometimes you can just get caught up in the weeds, whatever that is, of maybe you have too many shots planned out and you don't need all of that coverage. Maybe it's not a technical thing, but it's something else that's distracting the nuts and bolts of the scene and the emotional core. In pre-production, that's really the time to really figure that out. And of course that keeps evolving, and you keep building on that foundation, that all of those discussions that you've had with the director in your own breakdowns of the script, And I'm just talking about like story and emotion and character, but you've thought about all of that stuff. So the hope is like you just bring that with you by the time you get onto set. And so when you're coming up with shots, whether it's planned or you're improvising on the day because maybe your plan isn't working, it's coming from that place, that foundation, it's just almost like kind of oozing out of you because you've been just consuming. You're kind of like a sponge in pre-production and you're just living and breathing the story and these characters and these emotions. So you're just speaking this language. So it's just coming out of you when you're shooting.
I've heard you talk about that process as defining your sandbox, and I think you're really successful at it when it comes to narrative projects. But I'd also say that even on commercial or music video stuff you've done, at least the stuff that I've seen online, there is a perspective and a point of view to it. Are you also trying to define your sandbox on those short form projects? Is there a way that you're trying to hone that intuitive sense as well on those things?
Yeah, definitely. I think so. I think to one degree or another, just depending on the project. I don't do lookbooks for commercials. There just isn't time. And there's already a very in-depth treatment that a director has done. So maybe I'll pull references, like a folder of images that are just like whatever could inspire things visually. But yeah, there just isn't the same kind of pre-production time like you have on a film. Whereas, it's so different for commercials and music videos. But yeah, I think there definitely is a sandbox, so to speak. And there's always a visual language in every project, no matter what genre or medium it is. Because you always decide how you want to tell this particular story, whether it's selling a product or a TV series. There definitely is a way that you're conveying things visually and communicating visually.
Yeah.
It's interesting to kind of give yourself the permission to not be so caught up in the prep on a commercial or in even like what you were saying about how on a commercial it's okay to just lean into aesthetics and style and trends and gimmicks and stuff, because it's kind of like, as long as you're making the ad agency happy, like I think there's actually so much truth to that. And I think that as cinematographers, it's kind of important to have some self-preservation, like for not treating every project like a passion project, but instead actually understanding what the job that you're being asked to do is and just kind of executing it. And I don't know, when I look at both of the two of yours work, there's such an emphasis on narrative. And I can imagine that in order to achieve that, it's so important to just know where to devote your resources and your creativity. And it's cool to hear you kind of articulate that philosophy about the different approach for commercials and narrative.
Right. It's hard because there's a fine line, because it's not like you don't try with commercials. And I think they can be very creatively satisfying and you can have a deeply spiritual experience with the people you're collaborating with. I've had that lots of times and it's been beautiful. But there's just something different about films. Just because of going back to like, there's so many voices in commercials with all of the entities, and there isn't that just the filmmaker, the director. And the director has to answer and get approval from the agency and client. And so you don't have full autonomy. And sometimes that, you maybe don't like on a like narrative things, like larger budget stuff, like fully, just depending on the situation. But I think it's important to give yourself that freedom to be like, maybe you're not taking everything to heart on a commercial, if that makes sense. Your soul isn't becoming deeply affected by this commercial, and you can kind of save that for the films. At least that's kind of how I look at it. Do y'all do the same thing? Like you're saying, like self-preservation.
It's a learning process for me for sure. I've yet to kind of really do significant long form narrative work. And so it's a learning process for me, because it's like, it is easy sometimes, depending on who your collaborators are, to sometimes treat commercials like they're going to be some big epic sort of emotional thing. And then, like you said, there's so many cooks in the kitchen and there's so many different viewpoints that oftentimes you do lose your voice in it. And then if you've invested too much of your heart into that, that can be pretty crushing and things. So it's totally a process, but I love the move toward treating commercial work like it's literally what it is. It's commercial work.
Yeah, it's what it is. And you can find more joy in it when you do take that pressure off. and you're like, ah, cool. You look at it as a challenge. Like, okay, I get to figure out how to achieve X, Y, and Z and make the client, agency, director, everyone happy. Or I'm going to figure out this piece of gear and get good at this, or like really exercise this particular skill or just something. And you add that layer in, and then, it can be really fun, or practice communication and whatever it is. And I think that definitely informs your film work as well. When I first started shooting commercials, it was like, I think a lot more stressful because I was like putting so much weight into every single one. And most of the time you don't even get to finish them. You're not invited to the color. And I think that's so sad. It's just kind of taken away. So you don't even get to really do the last part of your job.
Right. Yeah, and you just touched on something that Ava had said on a previous episode that I thought was really cool too, which was because there are so many voices and because oftentimes it slips through your fingers, it can be cool to just approach it as like, let me have an amazing time with the people that get to come together for this moment, and like, let's just collaborate and have fun and make it exciting and joyful. Like it doesn't, it doesn't need to be so high stress and
precious. Exactly. Yeah. Because they can be like a blast, and just go off somewhere cool for a week and hang out. And, especially if you're in a good situation with a great director and a good producer, it can be a blast. Like maybe it's not the most exciting commercial, like, the creative isn't, but it still can be a fun experience with the people that you're with, or something you want to achieve technically. Yeah. I think there's always some silver lining.
I've got sort of like a little dangling question that I'd like to ask you about before we finish. And we don't have to include this, or you don't even have to talk about it if it's something you don't want to. But as I am someone who has not really come out of a traditional film school experience and have done my own learning on set as like a crew member, cinematographer, I feel like I have made some mistakes that haunt me still to this day.
Oh, yeah.
And I would be curious to know if you've had similar experiences as someone that didn't come out of film school, because you said that a lot of it was self-training or going to main media, but then there's also probably a lot of experiences on set where you're just learning. Like, did you?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, of course. Yeah. I think we all do, are you talking about just like with lighting, or just the way you handled something?
Both.
Like politically, or like
both. Like I mean,
all of the above.
Yeah. I'm so mean to myself. I'm like, I've got to apologize to this person.
Yeah. I mean, totally. Early on, like I never really, I got to observe some DPs, but not on a long-term basis. Like if I was crewing for a long amount of time. Yeah, totally. I mean, things like communication and leadership and management. And I can't think of specific examples, but just, things that I see that I did, and I just like cringe. Now I'm like, what was it? Oh my God, this is so bad. And absolutely. Yeah. And I think it's just like, I beat myself up, but I think the fact that that it's like you want to do better is the blessing, that you're aware of that and you want to improve, and get better at the same thing.
Yeah. And I think this might be even a more relevant question, but like as someone that got started a little bit later, relative to what we're used to seeing now, right? If you started when you're 25 or whatever, and maybe even making mistakes on set that you kick yourself for, how do you find patience for yourself? Or even that feeling of like, I'm not where I want to be right now. How do you find patience for yourself with all those things?
That's a good question, because I can't, I'm very hard on myself. And I think in the past I was probably like harder. I just feel like as I get older and learn more lessons, I'm able to show myself more love. And I think it's just most of the time not worth going down that dark hole and beating yourself up, because what's that going to do? It's just going to lead you into a depressive state. And we're all human. We all make mistakes, and none of us are perfect. And we're all just figuring this out, whether we went to film school or not. Like, I think really that has nothing to do with it, you know. Film school can be 2 or 4 years, but you're still really learning and coming into your own as a cinematographer when you start working for real and dealing with like all the personalities and egos of this industry. And I think it's just being gentle with myself and trying to catch myself when I start to like go down that rabbit hole of beating myself up, of not executing something a certain way or handling something in the exact way that I wanted to, just trying to learn it and apply it to the next time. Because it's really all I can do. And I know my intentions are always good. And I think the beautiful thing about this journey of being a cinematographer is I think we're always going to be striving to be better than we were, you know. Like I look at Blackbird now and that feels like the old me. I'm like, because it's already been, and when we started shooting that, we shot that in 2021, you know. Oh my God, I would have done these things differently. You know, and it's just like, it's another version of me in a way. And yeah, and I think the cycle is just going to continue. And I think that's a good sign because it means that you're evolving, you're fine-tuning your tastes and your sensibilities. You've had more life experiences. You find new things to inspire you. And that just all plays into how you're going to light the next scene and approach the next project, you know? And you're like, you know, wow, that didn't fucking work on the last one. But God, that made me stronger. And I hate that I had to go through this experience, but I see why I did, because I'm so much stronger now. And I'm such a better leader now because of that, you know?
Yeah.
So yeah, I try to just keep that patience. It's a really good question because it can be hard.
Yeah. I sometimes feel like there is an element of working in the film industry where time does really pay off, because I think in giving yourself time to grow and mature as a person and as an artist, you know, I think we put a lot of pressure on ourselves to perform fast and be perfect and be like the everything for a director, for a client, for an agency, like flawless. I know I certainly beat myself up endlessly about those things, but I do find that the longer I do it, the more I'm refining, you know, and like sanding down the things that like the edges, you know, or the things that like I know that I've fucked up on, or even if people didn't see them as fuck ups, I did, you know? So
and that's most of the time how it is, you know? I feel like most of the time it's just through our eyes that we see that. Yeah, totally.
It is like the one thing that I dislike about narrative projects is that they represent you from like 2 or 3 years ago. And it just sometimes like I just colored a movie and I am so excited and also horrified by some of my choices. You know? I'm like,
so long ago.
What was wrong with me? Like, what was I thinking? Oh my God.
Totally.
Why is that light back there so bright?
Oh my God, it happens on everyone. Yeah, absolutely.
And then you have to,
but I think it happens to all of us. I think even the greats that we look up to, I'm sure they would say the same things, and I hear them say the same things. You know, because like we only see that, but it's never that bad to other people.
Yeah. Can I say one thing about Ed Lockman?
Yeah.
I am also obsessed with Ed Lockman, right? I think his work is so beautiful and stunning. And I recently saw Mississippi Masala, like in very early film he shot. And it was good, but it was not current Ed Lockman, current era. So I was like, okay, we grew. Right?
Yeah, it made you grow. Yeah, exactly. That's helpful to watch the early stuff. Our heroes.
Yeah,
totally. On the flip side of the coin, you look at early stuff, like early stuff of your own, and you're like, that is actually good. Like, how did I know to do that? You know? Like, I remember, like, before I went to Maine, I was shot this short with some friends called Soups On, and, like, I literally had, like, one Kino flow in, maybe that's it. It was one other light, maybe 2 Kino flows in a Lowell light. And, like, I was impressed with myself because I was just on some of the lighting choices when I had no idea what I was doing, but the angle of light was what I would have done today, you know? It's like far side key, or someone was silhouetted, and That's just pure instincts.
Totally. Well, I also think that whole term contamination too is like relevant there, because it's like sometimes I feel like when you look back at older work, it's like there was a mixture of maybe mistakes or just like happenstance things that created like a contaminated image that still stands up. You know what I mean? Like it's not as considered and as like, oh, precise. Like I know all my technical stuff. It was kind of like messy in like a beautiful, organic, instinctual way. And
Totally.
One thing I was thinking about, Ava, when you were saying the thing about kicking yourself for like certain choices in the grade is like, I feel like when I look at great work and stuff, it's just like, oftentimes I think of it almost like music where the individual notes are not nearly as relevant as the overall song. And oftentimes I feel like what makes it like a good song is like the storytelling and not the individual like lighting choices. But us as cinematographers are so focused on those individual musical notes and like on like where maybe what notes are distracting us and stuff, when like a viewer is probably just swept up by the story and the emotion and like the broad strokes of the visual storytelling.
Exactly. That's what it's about. And that's why it's like, and I hear like Roger say this on his podcast, like when he has time away from a film and he revisits his own work 10 years later, it's like, oh, it's not that bad, you know, because you're able to really see it a little more objectively and see the forest for the trees, so to speak. And you know, like you were comparing it to music, you know, you're less like, because I guess when it's so fresh in your mind, when we light something, it's like frame by frame, shot by shot, and we're thinking of every individual light. And so we haven't thought about that in so long for that particular project, where it just we're able to really appreciate the big picture better.
Natalie, thank you so much for coming on our show today. And I'm so excited for people to hear this. I feel like there's so much amazing stuff in here that I feel like people are really going to love to hear. So thank you for giving us your time and sharing so much about your work and your philosophy. And I hope we get to do it again sometime.
Yeah, of course. Thank you so much for having me. This was so much fun.
Yeah, it's always really good to talk to you and spend time chatting. You have so much wisdom. You're so calm, so cool. Thank you.
That's sweet of you, Ava. I always love talking to you too.
Aww.
Awesome. Thank you. This episode of the Cinematography Salon podcast was produced by Peter Pascucci, Ava Benjamin Shore, and David Kruta, with original music by One Wave and edited by Corey Abel. We created this episode in partnership with the Cinematography Salon, and we would like to extend a special thanks to the salon community for supporting our efforts with this show. We'd also like to extend our gratitude to Able Cine for their continued support. If you're unfamiliar with their offerings, Able Cine provides services such as equipment rentals, sales, maintenance, training, and much more. Additionally, they host complimentary events at their various locations. For more details, please visit ablecine.com. If you enjoyed listening to the show, we encourage you to subscribe to our podcast and follow us on social media to stay up to date with our latest episodes and news. Thanks.